The colonial night came slowly and without hurry across the edge of the settlements, as it always did, spreading like a long, soft blanket over fields that had already given their harvest, and over houses built of rough timber and stone that kept out the cold only half as well as their builders had hoped. And inside those houses, people moved slowly by candlelight, and the sound of the wind brushed against the windows and the loose boards and the creaking roofs, and in the faint smell of wood smoke and earth, there was the feeling that autumn was nearly gone, and something colder waited beyond it, a thing that people did not name but always knew. And that night was called Halloween, though it was not the bright and noisy Halloween of later centuries, but a quieter, older one that had come across the ocean with the settlers who carried their fears and their small beliefs in pockets deeper than any coat. And those beliefs had changed on this new land where the forests were thicker and the nights longer, and the cries of unseen animals drifted from the trees like voices of the past. And so Halloween was not about trick-or-treat or glowing pumpkins. It was about the thin line between the living and the dead, and how on one night that line might fade like the mist in the fields, and the living might feel the breath of those who had come before. And in the small villages scattered across New England and the southern colonies alike, people spoke of it only softly, as if to name it too loudly would call it nearer. The children whispered of wandering spirits and ghost lights seen by travelers. The men who had gone into the woods late for firewood said they had seen shapes in the fog that did not belong to deer or man, and the women, closing shutters at dusk, sometimes paused when they thought they heard a step behind them, though the yard was empty. And yet none of this was enough to stop the ordinary life of a colonial evening, because chores still had to be done, food still needed to be prepared, and the hearth kept burning. So they moved through it all with the slow rhythm of survival, the sound of iron pots and wooden spoons echoing faintly like a heartbeat under the greater hush of the wind. Some said it was on Halloween that the boundary between the old country and the new one also felt thinner, that for a moment they remembered Ireland and Scotland and the far places of England from which their families had come, with the smell of peat fires and the stories of spirits and fairies and lost souls who walked the earth until the prayers were said for them. And now here they stood, in a strange, wild land filled with forests too vast to imagine, where the night seemed alive with its own breathing, and even the most practical among them felt a faint tremor of respect for the unknown. The towns themselves were small clusters of houses and meeting halls and barns and fences half buried in fallen leaves. The light from each home flickered out into the night, making a faint trail of gold in the blackness. And above all that, sky, deep and full of stars that seemed closer than anywhere else, a reminder of how thin the world might be between here and something beyond. The settlers did not have much time for celebration. They had harvest feasts, of course, simple gatherings of food and prayer and thanks, but Halloween was not marked with music or dancing. It was marked with quiet reflection, with the closing of doors and the lighting of extra candles, and sometimes a bowl of milk left by the hearth, or a piece of bread set aside not for the living, but for any visitor who might come unseen. For it was thought that kindness might protect a home better than courage could. The Puritans frowned on such things. They spoke against superstition, and yet in their sermons they still warned of spirits and of the devil's tricks. And so fear and faith walked side by side through the same narrow streets. The fields beyond the villages lay bare under the moon, the stubble of corn stalks like thin bones rising from the ground, and the scarecrows that had once guarded them now stood as silent watchers, with the wind tugging at their tattered clothes. And in the forest edges where no one went at night, the animals moved through the dry leaves, making sounds that could have been footsteps if one listened too closely. And the owls called in slow, hollow voices that drifted across the fields like the talk of the dead. There were stories told by the fireside of those who had gone missing near All Hallows' Eve, travelers who strayed from the road and never found their way back. Sometimes their bodies were found months later, sometimes never found at all. And always there were whispers that the forest took them, or that the spirits of the natives who had lived on the land before them were restless because their burial places had been disturbed. And though the ministers said it was nonsense, even they locked their doors earlier on that night and prayed a little longer before sleep. In some homes, the children carved faces into turnips or gourds, not pumpkins, for pumpkins were too rare and heavy, but small hollowed roots with rough little eyes and mouths that looked both smiling and sorrowful, and a tallow candle placed inside would glow weakly through the thin skin of the vegetable, casting strange shadows on the walls, and those who looked at them too long said the faces seemed to move and flicker as if remembering something lost long ago. The air smelled of apples and smoke and damp leaves, the kind of smell that comes only in autumn when the world is both dying and alive. The roads were mud and stone, lined by black trees, and the sound of a wagon wheel far off could carry for miles in the stillness. Some families said prayers for their ancestors that night, reading from old books that had crossed the ocean in wooden chests. Others simply sat in silence, thinking of names long forgotten, and of graves far away in England that no one would ever visit again. It was not fear so much as the weight of remembering, the sense that time was long and people small and the night endless. The dogs barked at nothing sometimes, and the horses in the stables stamped their hooves uneasily, and yet no one saw anything clear enough to name. The night deepened, the wind grew colder, the fire burned lower, and in the flicker of light faces seemed to change. The old man by the hearth looked for a moment like his father long dead. The woman spinning wool thought she heard her mother's voice in the crackle of the logs, and outside the trees seemed to lean closer as if listening. The settlers were used to hardship, hunger, storms, illness, but the silence of a colonial night could still unsettle them more than any of those, because it was a silence that seemed alive, that stretched too far in every direction. And in that silence, it was easy to believe that the old tales might be true, that souls walked the earth, seeking warmth, that witches might whisper on the wind, and that the world was wide but not empty. The few who dared to go out on Halloween night did so with care, carrying lanterns and staying close to the paths. They spoke in low voices and kept their eyes on the ground, because sometimes when they looked up, they thought they saw lights deep in the forest, pale and wavering, not like the steady glow of fire, but like something moving with thought and purpose. Yet when they told others the next day, the stories became softer, changed into jokes or small exaggerations, because no one wished to believe too much in the things they feared. Even the ministers could not banish old customs completely. The Scottish settlers still carved their turnip lanterns, the Irish still spoke of the fair folk, and the English of the wandering dead. And slowly these stories mixed with the strange new world around them. The flicker of foxfire on rotten logs became ghostlight. The sound of the wind in the branches became whispering voices, and the call of night birds became omens. So Halloween in colonial America was not a festival. It was a night of listening, of keeping the fire burning and pretending not to notice what might be outside the window. The moon climbed higher, and the frost formed on the grass, silvering the edges of the world, and the stars above looked sharp enough to cut through the dark. The rivers ran slow and black through the meadows, and the mills stood silent, their wheels frozen in the chill. By midnight, most were asleep or trying to be, wrapped in blankets while the wind rattled the shutters and the dogs whimpered in their sleep. And if anyone woke, they listened for a long moment before daring to move. There was always the sense that something unseen moved just beyond the edge of sight. The colonists had little reason to invent fear. They lived close to death in daily life, But Halloween reminded them that the world was older and stranger than their fences and farms could contain. They had crossed an ocean to find a new beginning, yet the night remained the same, vast and indifferent and filled with the quiet company of the unknown. In the morning, the frost would melt, the smoke would rise from chimneys, the fields would look harmless again, and the talk of spirits would fade like a dream. But for one long night each year, they felt the thinness of the world and the breath of the past. And in that stillness, ancient something stirred, not in malice, but in memory. And perhaps that was what they feared most, not the ghosts of others, but the reminder that they too would one day be ghosts, walking through fields no longer their own. And as the candles burned low and the final embers fell into ash, the sound of the first rooster echoed through the cold air, signaling the return of day.